Rachel Coffey. Is Rachel Coffey with us?
Yep, hello. Hi, you got me?
Hi. Yep, I have now, thank you.
Great.
Ms. Coffey, you're representing the Mornington Peninsula Climate Action Network.
Yes, that's right. Yes. Hi. I'd like to thank the panel for taking the time to read our submission and for giving me the opportunity to represent the concerns of our group. mpCAN, or the Mornington Peninsula Climate Action Network, unanimously oppose the Crib Point gas import jetty and the pipeline project. We strongly ask the panel to recommend to Planning Minister Wynne that the project not proceed. I'll be speaking today about a selection of the key concerns raised by members of our group. These include the unacceptable danger that our continued reliance on gas poses to our climate, the project's flaws in rationale and viability as the world transitions away from fossil fuels, and finally, the overwhelming community opposition to this project. The local community made it clear, even during stage 4 COVID lockdown, that there is absolutely no social licence for this project. But before I elaborate on those points, because I'm speaking on behalf of a group of people who are very concerned, I just want to take a bit of a moment to tell you about who we are. mpCAN is a group of a few hundred people from our local area, some of whom meet regularly to discuss our concern about climate change and advocate for strong climate action. We formed in late 2019 after our local council declared a climate emergency. Climate anxiety and fear for the future can be really isolating, but the formal declaration from the council was a huge relief for a lot of us. It was recognition that the climate crisis is real and that the only rational path forward is to act like we're in an emergency, which means banding together as a community and telling the truth about the state of the world. In the group, there are nurses and other healthcare workers, primary and secondary school teachers, scientists, ecologists, botanists, veterinarians, media professionals, public servants. We're young singles, parents, aunties, uncles, grandparents, we're all kinds of people. But we all feel a sense of personal responsibility to advocate for the safety of future generations. A lot of our work so far has been advocating to government about the need to urgently transition away from fossil fuels. Over the last several months, we've been getting together on Zoom for email writing sessions where we've been urging governments to avoid a gas-fired economic recovery from the pandemic and instead invest heavily in renewable energy. mpCAN is deeply concerned about our local environment, and our full submission includes references to the need to protect internationally recognised Ramsar wetlands and the local ecology. And while we definitely feel that the building of the pipeline and the daily operation of the gas import terminal would be a major threat to the local environment, this is a threat that's much bigger than our own precious and beloved bay. If the project was to go ahead, the emissions generated by the importation, processing, and ultimate consumption of gas pose an unacceptable danger to our global climate. The need to consider the viability of this project on climate change grounds is in fact reflected in state government policy. Under the Climate Change Act 2017, Victoria has set a 2050 target of net zero emissions. The Minister is required to consider this goal and other climate change implications when making a decision on any project. The world is at a crossroads. Climate change is an existential threat to the future of our planet and civilization as we know it. I volunteer as a facilitator for a non-profit called Climate for Change, and I spend my free time helping people understand the urgency and scale of the crisis. This is what I've learned this year. Unless we can drastically reduce our carbon emissions in the next 10 or so years, we risk triggering a series of environmental feedback loops, which push us to a tipping point where climate change ostensibly becomes a runaway train. We lose the ability to reduce carbon in the atmosphere, whatever we do, because our natural systems are basically already in collapse. For example, healthy trees absorb carbon from the atmosphere. However, global warming creates increased bushfire risk, which then when forests burn, they release carbon back into the atmosphere, which creates more warming, which then intensifies the bushfire risk, and so on. Or the melting of Arctic sea ice, which being white in an ideal world reflects heat. But as temperatures rise and the surface area of the ice shrinks, the dark ocean absorbs more heat, causing more warming, causing more ice to melt. And Arctic ice has already reduced by about 40% since the 70s. So there are several of these feedback loop systems already at play, and the worst case scenario is that we've already reached a tipping point. But the best case scenario is that we still have a small but shrinking window to act. This would mean getting our emissions down to zero as fast as possible, while also drawing carbon from the atmosphere. The AGL project is incompatible with these goals. The gas imported would produce an enormous amount of carbon emissions, while also damaging opportunities for carbon sequestration in seagrass. I'll expand on that later. This is all incredibly depressing, but the global response seems to have quickened in the last few months. Things are changing really fast, and the energy and climate landscape already looks really different now to how it did a few months ago when we wrote these submissions. Governments around the world, as well as the private sector, are committing to a rapid transition from fossil fuels. This project is looking more redundant and less viable by the day. Australia's major trading partners have committed to a net zero 2050 target recently, including South Korea, Boris Johnson's Conservative government in the UK, the soon-to-be-formed Biden administration in the US, and even China has committed to a 2060 goal. Australia has become the global laggards. Last week, one of the world's most senior diplomats, Christiana Figueres, described Australia's approach to climate policy as suicidal. New Zealand declared a climate emergency just last week. We need to start acting like we're in an emergency. We no longer have the time for a business as usual approach. Our house is on fire. Given the world around us is committing to a transition from fossil fuels, mpCAN believes that AGL's project rationale is deeply flawed. According to AGL's evidence, if approved, Crib Point would import more gas in 2040 than in 2030. The project rationale states that, according to the AEMO March 2020 Victorian Gas Planning Update, Victoria will be in an LNG deficit by 2024. But those projections don't consider a sharp reduction in the demand for gas, particularly the demand for gas in the residential market, where people are rapidly switching to cheaper, more efficient and more sustainable alternatives. The trend away from gas is also supported by many local governments, many of whom are already in the early stages of residential gas phase-out programs. And to be clear, this project, if approved, would result in significant emissions. It would rely upon, enable and incentivise Victoria's ongoing reliance on gas. When you combine not just the operational emissions generated by the importation and processing of the gas, but also factor in the emissions produced when the gas is actually consumed, it's staggering. 8.5 million tonnes of CO2e per year. So for context, that's equivalent to just under 8% of Victoria's total emissions in 2017. And in our own lives, we're used to comparing the kinds of emissions that come from our houses and our cars. We know that they're big sources of emissions. So compare it to our cars, that's 3/4 of Victoria's annual emissions from light passenger vehicles, or compared to our houses, it's about the same yearly emissions produced by 1 million average Victorian homes. Although LNG has been described as cleaner than coal, it remains a major contributor of greenhouse gas emissions. It is still causing climate change. Leaks, or fugitive emissions, are almost guaranteed in Victoria's transmission system. Methane, the primary chemical in LNG, is a greenhouse gas 20 times more potent than carbon dioxide. Cheaper, better, less destructive alternatives already exist and are already being adopted. This is not the time for half measures in Victoria's energy transition. AGL and the Victorian government should support, promote and invest in state-of-the-art renewable energy rather than soon-to-be obsolete polluting technologies. I said earlier that I'd touch on not just the project's promise to generate dangerously high emissions, but also its potential to hinder the local environment's ability to store carbon. The seagrass ecosystems in Western Port Bay are natural carbon sinks. These seagrass ecosystems are also sensitive to disturbances, like temperature change, oxidation, smothering, or light obstruction. All significant risks in the proposed project. In addition to biodiversity loss, damaged seagrass ecosystems would also be a double blow to the climate. If the seagrass dies off, it would release millions of tonnes of ancient stored carbon into the atmosphere. This would also significantly compromise any future opportunities to explore blue carbon drawdown projects in Western Port Bay. The surrounding wetlands and mangroves have similar blue carbon potential. This is a time to be investigating ways to protect, revegetate and multiply these ecosystems. To knowingly destroy them is bafflingly short-sighted. Finally, I want to finish off by talking about the scale of the community opposition to this project. There's certainly no social licence to proceed. There's been an enormous community effort to mount a defence against this project, which obviously the panel will be well aware of because I've seen the hearing schedule. But what I'd like to reinforce is just how difficult it was for the community to engage in that process during stage 4 COVID restrictions. For every formal submission made, which I believe was already a record-breaking number, there would be many people who were either unaware the consultation process was underway or did not have the time or ability to engage. From the experience of our group, our collective capacity to be involved has been severely diminished this year, even on issues that keep us awake at night. Parents struggled to find time to wade through and respond to the 11,000-page EES while juggling the unique challenges of working from home while educating and caring for children at home. Others faced financial hardship, emotional distress, and fear for the health of ourselves and our loved ones. Since our mpCAN meetings started being held on Zoom back in March, our average attendance has dropped by 50 to 75%. During the community consultation process, the community was basically just in survival mode. Also, the Mornington Peninsula's largest age demographic had even further barriers to their engagement. The median age of Mornington Peninsula locals is significantly above the national average. Almost half the population is over 50. Retirees are often really engaged in this type of community process. Retirees are also often very connected to their community, but almost exclusively through face-to-face activities like church, libraries, cafes, bowls club, or the RSL. But without being able to meet in person for months, many elderly people will not have even known this consultation period was happening. In a further blow, the local newspaper, The Leader, also stopped distributing hard copy print versions of their papers during that time. I'm unsure how non-internet users, a larger than average percentage of our local community, could have engaged in this process at all. Normal environment groups like ours and others would have held rallies on the beaches. We would have letter dropped, we would have set up stalls at shops and libraries, run town hall sessions and booked face-to-face meetings with our MPs. In fact, I personally had a meeting booked with my local MP for March, but it had to be cancelled because of COVID. And all of the other activities I just mentioned were straight up illegal during the public consultation phase. So instead, I'd like the panel to have a bit of a glimpse into what those months looked like for mpCAN and other environment groups in the area. Like many other things in 2020, this whole process was challenging. We met regularly on Zoom to workshop strategies to reach people. We met on Zoom again to discuss how the submission process worked and try to help each other detangle complex information. Environment Victoria and Save Western Port held online rallies. When you clicked through to see the participants, there was page after page of faces on the screen. Hundreds of people who'd all logged on to show their frustration in the only way that they could. mpCAN tried to create sort of Venn diagrams of people who lived in different townships so that we could form a bit of a patchwork quilt of 5-kilometre radius zones so that we could get information posters up into public places and essential shops. I'm incredibly proud of the community for rising in the way that we have, because we know that this is a climate emergency and that the decisions that we make right now really matter. The number of submissions against this project is not the result of effective community consultation by the proponent. It's instead a reflection of the sheer force of resistance from the Mornington Peninsula and broader Victorian communities. This is a deeply unpopular project. Climate change is the issue of our time, and it's the greatest challenge our species has ever faced. We're not all climate scientists, but we all know that climate change scares us. To allow this project to proceed is to continue to invest in a future reliant on fossil fuel, and that is a future that won't end well. mpCAN urges the committee to advise the Planning Minister that this project is unsustainable and inappropriate in this critical moment in history. Thank you for taking the time to listen to me and for allowing me to present.
Thanks, Ms. Coffey. You mentioned at the beginning how many members mpCAN had, but I didn't take a note. Can you just refresh my memory?
At the time of running the submission, we had about 140 members. We now have about 250. There's a sort of core group of about 6 who discuss the ongoing operations. And before COVID, there'd be about 30 of us that would meet monthly.
Okay. Thank you. Any questions from the ISA members?
No, thank you, Mr. Chair.
No, thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thanks, Ms. Coffey. Thanks for your submission, and thanks for being with us this afternoon.
Thank you.
Thank you.